So, hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unpacking Possibility. I'm your host, Tracy Stein, and today I'm really excited to introduce you to Erika Andersen. Now, you may actually already be familiar with Erika because she's quite a force. She is the founding partner of Proteus International, a coaching, consulting, and training firm that focuses on leader readiness. And she's been doing this for a long time. She's worked with organizations that you've absolutely heard of, like Amazon and Spectrum and the Yale School of Public Health. And she's the author of 4 best-selling books. Now, today, we're going to talk about her most recent book, Change from the Inside Out, Making You, Your Team, and Your Organization Change Capable. And I can't think of anything more apt in this era of constant change. So welcome, Erika.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm really excited to learn more, not only about your book, which, by the way, is very psychologically sound, and we'll get to that in a bit. I enjoyed reading it, but your journey, because it's so remarkable. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
So we spoke about this just a bit before we started recording, but I thought it might be useful and interesting for your listeners to hear about how I started my company. So my company, Proteus, I started in 1990 when, it was a different world then. And I started the company for 2 reasons. I had been working in organizational development and management leadership training for about a decade at that point. And one thing I noticed is, and I'm old enough that I remember this, I don't know how many of your listeners remember this, but in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, the skills that we think of as so critical now, leadership, management, teaming, communication, those were always called soft skills. Like they don't really matter, and the only thing that really matters is your job skills. And what I saw as the world started even then to speed up and flatten out is that those skills were going to become increasingly important. In fact, our first Proteus tagline was skills for mastering the future, which is what I felt those were. And I wanted to really have a company that put those front and center. And then the second thing was that I wanted to be what has come to be known as a business partner, although that was not yet a term of art, because at the time in the 80s, consulting firms and certainly training firms were really kind of widget sellers. Like, we want to buy listening training. And what I wanted to be was that partner for clients. And this actually became the mission of Proteus, and still is 32 years later, that our mission is to help our clients clarify and move toward their hoped for future. So that's what we do. We work with our clients to say, where are you actually trying to go? Either individually, who do you want to become, or organizationally, what do you want to become? And then we have a whole variety of tools and support and processes to help you get there. So that's, and that was 32 years ago. And here we are today. It all seems to be working out.
It does quite well. And along the way, you've written a series of best-selling books to help people achieve what you just spoke about. And I'm wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about that journey.
Yes, I did an interview recently about this book. And one of the questions was, when did you know you wanted to be a writer? And my answer to the question was, I don't think I ever didn't want to be a writer. Even as a little kid, I remember being in school, and when there was an essay, I would get all excited while everybody else was rolling their eyes. I just have always loved the language. I've always loved writing. I've always loved the process of saying something that seemed important to me as clearly as possible, and in a way, both in a clear and engaging way, in a way that was both clear and would help people go, oh, And when I started to write books, and this has been true all along, my first book came out 15 years ago, it's because I got curious about something that seemed important to me. And I felt like if I answered, some core question that I was curious about, that it would crack an important code for people. So, like, for instance, my first book, Growing Great Employees, is about how to be a good manager of people. And the question that I got curious about is, why are most managers so bad, and why do we underestimate the importance of it so much, And so that led to that. And so for every book I've gotten curious, and it's true for my latest book too. I got very curious about a couple of what I thought were important questions about change. Even though we've had a change practice for over a decade. And in the course of that, I just got curious about, well, why, so we can talk about that too. But that's really what led me to write books, is wanting to crack codes that would be helpful to people.
I think it's such a great reason to do so, right? Not just to write, but to really kind of better understand something yourself as well and make it accessible to people. You just mentioned something a moment ago that I think is so true. And I'm assuming you see this at all levels of organization size, right? From small businesses to large ones. A lot of times people have some skill set for what they do in management, but lack other skills that are really equally important, like you mentioned before, the soft skills of communicating. I'm just going to reframe it as a psychologist, like being able to step into the mind of your employees.
Yes.
So sometimes people seem to know a lot about the other kind of aspects of business that aren't as interpersonal.
Yeah.
And it seems like you really tackled that in this most recent book as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just to go there, the questions that I wanted to answer, the reason I started thinking about writing a change book in 2018 are, as I said, we'd already had a change practice, and I feel like we're quite good, very good at integrating the human side, what you were just talking about, the human side of change, and the kind of nuts and boltsy technical side of change. And even so, I noticed that change was still really, really hard for people. And so that was the first question I got curious about, is why is change so hard for most of us, especially change that's imposed upon us, when it's somebody else's idea, right? So that was question number one. And question number two was, okay, what actually happens inside an individual human being when they move through change, when they make a change? Because I didn't feel like that we had enough clarity about that. And again, I felt like if I could get clear about those two things on behalf of readers, then that would be useful. So, having read the book, that I talk a lot about both those things, and I feel like I have pretty good answers to those questions now.
You really do. And one of the things that struck me about the book is that it really, as I mentioned earlier, it's very psychologically, it's psychologically rooted. It's rooted in concepts that, as a mental health professional, I would probably take for granted. Like, well, yeah, of course we have to think about this, but absolutely most people aren't necessarily thinking about change as consciously and as strategically as you outlined in the book, but you make 100%. It really accessible.
And it's what gets in the way of success. I mean, I mentioned this statistic in the book, and I think it's really central to exactly what you're saying. Is McKinsey has research that shows that 70% of organizational change efforts fail in some way. Either they fail entirely, or they don't achieve the goals in the time they said they're not successful on some level. 70%. And then if you unpack that one level down, their research shows that the main reasons that is true, as they say, are lack of employee buy-in and lack of management support. And that's entirely individual, human, psychological, and emotional, right? So to me, to understand why change is hard for us, and then how we can rewire ourselves to get better at going through change, it's absolutely necessary now if we want to, as individuals and as organizations, succeed in this era of nonstop change, So I think, and it's why we ended up calling the book Change from the Inside Out. It's like any change, whether you're talking about one person making a change in their lives or a huge organizational transformation that affects 100,000 people, starts with each individual person making that change. And unless a critical mass of people go through the mindset shift that's necessary to make the change, it just won't happen. It won't be adopted.
You're so right. And I took some notes as I was reading. You said something really early on, that the amount of change and the rate and the number of changes people need to make in general and in business has increased dramatically in the last few decades. So I'm
Yes.
wondering if you could explain that very core concept
Yes.
to our listeners.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. And I'd also love to talk about it in the context of that was it, in a way, it's the answer to my first question of why change is hard. Because as I started to think about this, I looked at our history as human beings, and I realized that if you look at a human person, one human person's life, 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,000 years ago, that life was pretty much the same from beginning to end. I mean, if somebody who grew up in the US or in Kenya or in Asia or Europe 200 years ago, their life was to us unimaginably stable. They would almost certainly be born and grow up where their parents were born and grew up, where their kids were going to be born and grow up. They would do the same work their parents had done. They'd eat the same food. They'd go to the same church. They'd live in the same field. I mean, just, and even the uncommon occurrences were predictable. Some years the crops will be good, some years they'll be bad, people will die, babies will be born. Incredibly predictable and stable. And then if you think about change in that person's life, the changes that came were aberrations. They were a danger and a threat. It was a flood or a famine or a war or a plague, And so almost without exception, the best bet for that person in that stable life was to, as quickly as possible, come back to the known. That homeostatic urge really served us for thousands of years. So we have thousands of years of conditioning, probably natural selection on top of it, that, change is bad. And going back to the known is the safe bet. So here we are now in this entirely different world. It started speeding up, I think, in the 19th century. And then now we're on this, geometric curve of speeding up change. And as you know, the example I use at the beginning of the book is I'm old enough that when I was a little kid, TV was a new thing. We got our first TV when I was 3 or 4. And then 10 years later, we got our first color TV, right? So that was even 60 years or so ago, the pace of change was still pretty stately. You had 10 years before and now that level of technological innovation happens every 45 minutes on our phones, right? So we're just not wired for this. That's the conclusion I came to. Bad news. Good news is we're capable of rewiring ourselves. You know this as a psychologist. We're capable of learning how to think differently and respond differently to circumstances. So that's where I went next, is how do we rewire ourselves?
So talk a little bit about that, because you're absolutely right. We do seek this homeostasis, both biologically and psychologically and socially. We've had a lot of change imposed on us. You alluded before to, it might have been before we started recording, I can't remember, but change that is imposed upon us feels much more challenging than change that is something we reach for ourselves volitionally. Right. And it's interesting, sorry, a little tangent from there, is that my most recent podcast episode, I talked about how even good change can induce feelings of grief and anxiety.
Yes.
And this false kind of idealizing of what we left because it was easier in the sense that we knew it.
Exactly. So that leads right into what I then found, which was the most exciting discovery, is so I really thought and observed and questioned and asked a lot about this and came to this thing that we've come to call the change arc, which is my depiction of how people, generally speaking, go through a change when they do make a change. And so, as you know, the first thing we noticed is that people, when a change comes at them, they want answers to very predictable questions. And the questions that we ask about change, and it's funny, as you say, even when it's good change, and often even when it's our idea, we still ask the same questions, which are, what does this mean for me? Literally, what am I going to have to do differently? That's the first thing we want, right? Because we have this homeostatic urge. The second thing is why? Why is this happening? Again, because we have this strong preference, most of us, for the status quo, we need a really good reason to even consider changing. And then the third thing is, what will it look like when it's done? Tell me about the post-change future. And it was so interesting, Tracy, when I was researching for the book, I found, and I'm sure you're aware of this, that a lot of psychologists now seem to believe that our deepest fear is fear of the unknown.
Sure.
And that also just completely lines up with homeostasis, coming back to the known. So if you're telling me that I need to change, I don't want to just have this murky, like I have no idea tell me what it's going to look like. So we start gathering that information. We call that the proposed change phase. It's just like, tell me what you're actually talking about here. Then, and this is the heart of it, and the reason we call it change arc is because it's harder on the upslope and easier on the downslope. So as you're going up the change arc and as you're gathering this information, and this goes right to what you were saying before, generally speaking, people's initial mindset about a change, particularly one that's being imposed upon them, is that the change is going to be difficult and costly and weird. And difficult means I don't know how to do this, and other people are going to make it hard for me to do. Just there's lots of obstacles, right? Costly, this was so interesting when we figured this out. Costly means I assume this change is going to take from me things I value. And it could be simple things like time and money, but it's more likely, you're more likely to assume that it's going to be important intrinsic things like identity and power and reputation and relationships and freedom, right? All these things, it's like going to take all this away from me. And then weird just means, oh, this is not how we do things around here. So imagine that you have, it's a kind of negative confirmation bias, because you're assuming the change is going to be difficult, costly, and weird, even as you're asking these questions. So you say, well, what is this change going to mean for me? Well, you're going to have to learn how to do, oh my gosh, that's going to take so much time. And why are we fixing a thing that's not broken? And I've been doing this way 20 years, right? So even as you're asking those questions, you're answering them negatively out of your mindset. So then what we noticed is that when someone actually does make a change, it's most often not much changes externally. It's just that their mindset shifts, literally. And they start saying to themselves, in effect, oh, you know what? I can see how this change could be easy, or at least doable. I can see how this change could be more rewarding than costly, that it could give me more than it takes away. I could see how this could be normal. I'm looking around, maybe other people that are like me will start doing it. And this is why it's so important for leaders to model change. My boss, who I like and admire, she's doing it, and so it starts to feel normative. And we noticed that as soon as someone was fairly consistently thinking, oh, this could be, not even that it is now, but that it could be easy, rewarding, and normal, then they're open to learning and then doing the new behaviors that the change requires, and the change can actually be adopted. So we realized that the heart of that change arc was this mindset shift, which is so exciting because we can shift our mindsets, right? That's not dependent on anybody else.
So true. I'm having a million thoughts as you're talking about this, because we could talk about any sort of change in the same way, whether it's one person making a behavioral change, whether it's, eating better or starting an exercise program or moving to a new city and so forth, whether it's a social change, a change in the way we live our daily lives. And certainly the pandemic has caused many of those. And again, embedded in what you're saying is people tend to not only cling to reactively, very, fearfully in a way, to the way things are or used to be, but they idealize it and can make it seem better than it actually is or was.
Totally agree, Tracy. And therefore, in the contrast, then the change seems even more difficult and costly and weird, right? It's like this old past, which was not even that great to begin with. No, it was easy, rewarding, normal. And so this new thing you're asking me to do, I can't even imagine how I can do it. People double down and get stuck. And so the important thing for us as individuals and for us as leaders to know is that helping ourselves and others move through that mindset shift is a service to humanity, service to ourselves, and a service to others, right?
Absolutely. It's interesting because I'm going to say something that's going to sound like these two things can't both be true. but on the one hand, again, we've been talking about how people tend to cling to what's familiar and requires less energy and effort to think about or to do. They resist change in a lot of ways. But so we're kind of wired for that. And yet we are also wired to be able to be cognitively flexible if we allow ourselves to make those shifts. And you use something in your description of what people need to do that I don't know if you're aware of it being a kind of a self-hypnotic technique, because when somebody can envision something in the past, in the future, or actually at any point in time, but in the future, and can imagine practicing being in this new space and way of being, that is actually self-hypnotic. And it absolutely does change people's emotions and what they feel that they can do behaviorally.
100%. Oh my God, I couldn't agree with you more. And we've taken advantage of that. As I said to you earlier, I've had some wonderful experiences with self-hypnosis myself, and also had been doing meditation for 50 years. And so that power that the mind has to envision, when we do another book that I wrote is called Being Strategic, and it's about this vision and strategy process that we do with companies. And a core of it is to put people in effect in a time machine, because people get so wrapped up in the present. But to say to them, okay, so envision your company 2 years or 3 years from now, when it's the way you want it to be. What does that look like? And not only can people do that, it kind of gets them past their stuckness, but they can envision wonderful futures. And then to your point, it makes it so much more likely that they'll move toward it. Because when you envision, I'm basically just saying what you said.
True.
But when you envision something powerfully, it assumes a reality in your mind and even in your body. And so I'm basically just agreeing with you. I think envisioning the future when a change has been made, the more you can help people do that, the more you can unstick them from their fear and hesitation.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a bunch of reasons why that's probably true. And, one of them is that when we mentally rehearse doing things that could be scary, we desensitize ourselves to the scary part. We practice, we experience the success before we're even successful, which makes success more likely.
Exactly right.
Yeah, so it really is self-hypnotic, and it is, it's such a commonly used kind of technique and guided imagery. It's useful because, again, we're made to be able to do that, but it absolutely takes the sting out of it. And shifts
that's really true. As you said that, Tracy, I was thinking about a session that I was doing just recently, a vision strategy session with some clients, and their vision implies a lot of change. It was, where we want to change our company in a variety of ways. And there was one guy who was pretty, negative's too strong a word, but he was skeptical.
Okay.
And then once we created the vision, something really shifted in him. And he came to me in a break and said, we really could do this, couldn't we? And I said, yeah, I think you really could. And so it not only took the sting out of it, as you said, which is right, it kind of moved him into this hopeful place, which was really powerful.
It really is. And, I'm just thinking, you mentioned the social phenomenon of when you see other people doing something, not only doing something, but feeling comfortable and optimistic doing it and feeling like it's a good thing.
Yeah.
It really does kind of radiate out. It does make any kind of change easier. And there's kind of ineffable thing to it too, because it's more than just modeling. It's this kind of intangible, but very potent kind of thing.
I think that's right. And modeling is, as you say, it's just the tip of the iceberg, because one of the things that I learned a lot from one of my business partners' brother, his name's Peter Mitchell. I give him props in the book. He has a company that does social marketing, which is, marketing behavior change basically to large groups of people. So they've done campaigns many years ago, they did campaigns about wearing seatbelts, or they've done campaigns around teenagers not smoking. And I've learned a lot from listening to him and reading his stuff about what normal means. And it is that the power of normal, because we are tribal creatures. When we look around and see people who we think of as being like us,
Yes,
doing something, then it normalizes it. Then it's like, oh, okay, then that seems like that. Not only is that an okay thing to do, it seems like something I could and should do. So it is a very powerful social construct. And I know I said this before, but I want to emphasize it. Those of you listening who are leaders, this is why it is so critically important for leaders to lead the way in their actions and in their words with a change, because that is a huge part of normalization. That when people we admire and emulate and think of as the arbiters in a way, which is what we think of as good bosses, do something, we're much more likely to be open to considering doing it. And, we've all had the opposite experience, I think, of working in a company where a boss tells us to do something that they are clearly not doing themselves, and just they lose all credibility. No, everybody's like, well, then no, I'm not doing it,
It's so true. I'm just looking at my many notes here. One thing I think that people will relate to right away, and in keeping with what you've been saying, is you use a real world example of a company going through the process of change, from the very uncomfortable original initiation by one person, a small company, to throughout the whole process. And I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yes, let me step back, because it's all about the power of story. So each one of my books has had a frame story, if you will, or either a frame story or a small group of human beings that I use as models. But story is so powerful. And I think particularly in change, story is powerful, because the last thing I wanted is for this to be another heady theoretical book about change, because there are a million of them out there. And with my basic premise that change begins with an individual person going through this arc, I really wanted to connect the reader to that. So I very specifically, and I made up this company, Moment Jewelry, but based on lots of client experiences I had, and I made it small enough, big enough to have problems. I figure there's about 100 people at Moment, but small enough so that the reader could see the shape of change as they went through it and could relate to it on an individual level. And it's so funny. I feel like I know these people, Jade and her dad, and I wrote this whole backstory, and a lot of people have said to me that it was helpful to them to have that connection. And so I love that you brought that up. I do feel like stories are, stories. I talk a lot about stories in my work, and stories are the DNA of certainly pre-literate societies. Before we were able to read and write, stories were how we communicated the important stuff, because stories are much more memorable and sticky than just factual recitations. So again, I look to history a lot. For many thousands of years, we've told stories. I mean, I don't want to tell me if I'm going too far afield on this, but there's a part of Spain that my husband and I love. Northern Spain is called Asturias. And there's a cave in Asturias called Tito Bustillo, and it has cave drawings that they figure are about 30,000 years old. And the only reason they're so well preserved is because at some point in the distant past, there was some kind of a landslide, and it was, so it was closed. And then some hikers, some kids 30 or 40 years ago, found it. And as you look at it, you can see that it's stories. It's the stories of, here's how we hunted these animals, and here's how we, fell in love. There's hearts and people. I mean, we've been telling stories for tens of thousands of years, So I feel like that's something from the past that we can carry forward and really use well, is to continue to tell powerful stories. Like the story I just told about Tito Bustillo,
And it's totally true. And I think that's one of the many reasons why the book is so approachable. I was thinking, I was laughing to myself a little bit as I was reading because I, had this kind of dual awareness of myself reading the book and taking in what you're saying and thinking like, well, I don't have a business degree, and I could very easily and readily understand what you were saying and why it was important. And the story definitely makes it that much more approachable, wherever somebody is, whether they are somebody with a lot of expertise in business or really none.
Yes, I love that. Thank you, Tracy. And when I sold the book to my publisher, I have a weird way of I write books and then I sell them, which is the opposite how most people do it.
It
But
worked out
and good for the publishers, because then they're not kind of buying a pig in a poke. They see what they're getting. But when I was talking to this wonderful man, Neil at Vericola, who ended up being my editor, he said, well, so who is this book for? And I said, I know I'm not supposed to say this, Neil, and it's for everybody who's going through a change. And he laughed and he said, yeah, we're not. So who's it really for? And I said, okay, if I had to narrow it down, it's for leaders who are tasked with helping their teams and their organizations through change. That's the kind of bullseye. And I really hope that anybody who picks it up will be helped to understand better about how change works and how they can become more change capable.
Absolutely. I think you've achieved your objective. Absolutely. So I'm just trying to look at my notes again, just because I have, again, a million questions and I don't want to bombard you with all of them. You already spoke about how the why needs to be personally meaningful, of course, with every change. Yeah. I put an asterisk next to this. You said fear is not a great motivator. I'm so glad you said that, because I think there still remains this myth that scaring people makes them not only make change, but stick with it and do well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I feel so strongly about this. There's a very famous, I shall remain nameless, change guru kind of, who really talks a lot about burning platform and about the best way to get people to change is to tell them that if they don't, they're all going to die kind of. And fear is not a great motivator. It's a powerful short-term motivator, like a stick of dynamite, but as you know this as a psychologist, it's a terrible long-term motivator because it's so exhausting. And so what people try to do, even though they're motivated in the short term, is figure out how to get away from it. Yes. And the change, that mostly means like, okay, I'll do what you're making me do right now, but I will try to just get it. And now I feel even worse about this change because you're scaring me into it. So I'm either going to leave the company or find a way to kind of like hide out until it's over. It has huge backlashes that are not helpful. And so there's all that. Plus, it's just not good on a human interactive level. I mean, if you scare somebody, then they don't trust you. And so that doesn't work long-term either.
No, absolutely. And as you were saying that, I was thinking also, if your management style is to generate fear or, be coercive, what happens is that you won't hear on anything honest from your employees. Like you said, they'll be motivated to avoid negative consequences, including negative interactions, but you won't actually learn what's really going on, including good ideas that could be helpful that you might not have thought about.
That is so true. You won't get their best and you won't get the worst. And in change, both of those things are so critical, because when you're, in our 5-step process, the last step of our model, our change model, is keep the change going. And one of the reasons that's important is because every change, no matter how small, has unintended consequences. So even if you plan really well and you help people through the change, things are not going to turn out the way you thought, because anything we do relative to the future is just our best guess, right? So things are not going to turn out the way you thought. And if you don't have a good, trusting, open line of communication with the people who are affected by the change, you might not even find that out. You might not even find out that it's not going the way you want it to. But second, even if they're willing to tell you that, which is unlikely, then they won't be willing to share their ideas with you about how to make it better. So couldn't agree with you more. That's one of the reasons fear just is not great in change.
It's just not. I'm so glad you said that. So, embedded in what you've said before is managing your self-talk.
Yeah.
And you gave some examples before in terms of your envisioning the change being positive, whether you're a leader or someone having to adapt to change. Can you give some examples of what useful, healthy self-talk is around
Yes.
organizational change?
Well, if you don't mind, I'll step one step back from that. And I did I guess a webinar, modern webinar, a Zoominar, with a group of senior leaders in one of our client companies yesterday, and actually taught them how to manage their self-talk. And so I'll give a little 2 minutes on that.
Great.
So, so here's our process, which I learned from a mentor of mine, a wonderful guy named Marty Seldman, many, many years ago, who had written a couple of books about self-talk. So if you're trying to get control of your self-talk, because we get, you know, this as a psychologist, we just get run around by our self-talk all the time. It's mostly unconscious, and it, you know, kind of like tells us to do stuff. And so, and a lot of our, you know, we all talk to ourselves all the time. Some people in words and some people they're now discovering in images, but it just is this constant internal monologue, some of which is fairly benign. You know, I mean, some of it's just like, I like oranges. That person has pretty eyes. I don't like these shoes, you know. But then some of it is just remarkably unhelpful, especially our self-talk about change. So the first thing we encourage people to do is recognize what they're saying to themselves, especially, and I always say, work backwards from your negative reactions. So if a change is coming at you and you're feeling anxious and fearful and hesitant, just notice your internal monologue. Notice what you're saying to yourself. That's what recognize means. And then, and I'm sure you have encouraged people to do this, we say, record it, write it down. When you write down your self-talk, either electronically or physically with pen or pencil, it separates you from it. And so you feel like you can have control over it. When it's just when it's inside your head, it feels so intrinsic and true. It's like, it's the way it is. So you write it down. And I remember the very first time I did this, which was 30 plus years ago. I'll tell you about the situation I was in. It's a good example. It's a good example about change. So it was when I first started my company. So this is 1990. And I was going to be talking to a prospective client. And I was sitting in this person's waiting room. And he was an older, senior, white guy, regular, who was running things 30 plus years ago, right? And I found myself just being unaccountably nervous. And usually I don't get, but my hands were sweaty and my heart was beating. And I'm like, whoa. So I worked backwards from that. And what I was saying to myself was, I'm young and a woman, and he's going to completely dismiss me. Right?
Probably weren't wrong.
Predicting that this new situation, this change situation, was going to be difficult, costly, and weird. I was predicting that to myself. And it was so funny. I heard myself say that. I pulled out my little, yellow pad that I took in the universe, and I wrote that down. I'm young and a woman, and he's going to completely dismiss me. And as soon as I wrote it down, it was so great because I said to myself, wait, I don't know if that's true. Right? As soon as I wrote it down, I had enough separation to question it. So then the third step is then revise. And we encourage people, and this goes to the heart of what you were asking, to revise their self-talk so that it's more hopeful, yet still believable, seems accurate to you. Because if you revise it to something that seems like, pardon my French, BS, it won't have any impact on you and you'll just slam back to your original, right? So if I'd said, oh, he'll love me, I'm not going to believe that. I don't know if that's true, right? So instead, what I wrote down was, I don't know how he'll see me. Absolutely true. And I have a lot to offer.
Also,
isn't that great?
Yeah,
accurate,
fantastic.
hopeful, not made up. I don't know how he'll see me, and I have a lot to offer. And it was like magic, Tracy. My hands unsweated, my heart calmed down. And then in the 10 or 15 minutes that he made me wait to show me how cool he was, I guess, it was like whack-a-mole. I would say, oh, I don't know how he'll see me. And I have a lot to, so I just kept repeating it, right? So that's our process: recognize, record, revise, repeat. And you can do that in any circumstance, but it's especially valuable with change. When you see yourself saying, oh, this is going to be so hard and I don't know how to do it. Wait, I don't know how hard it's going to be. And they say they're going to have some training. That's accurate and hopeful, right?
I love that you said all that. And I did make a joke when you were first telling your story. It's like, well, it could have been true, or it's probably true. Because back in the 90s, to show up as a woman and a young woman, I think it would have been very hard, most likely to have been heard by some senior male exec. I don't think that there's anything wrong with saying that. The reason I'm mentioning that is because a lot of times people's fears might have some grounding in previous
Yes, exactly.
experience.
Yes.
Those are the harder ones to shift. But you were spot on, even without thinking, having your system, formally created. Then you were spot on, because even if there is some likelihood that that's true or that has actually happened before, you didn't know, and that probably shifted the outcome of that meeting.
I'm
Because
sure
you
that it
shifted.
did. I'm sure that it did, because I did exactly what you said. It just shifted my assumption to the neutral. I don't know how he'll see me. And the second half was kind of like, the subtext was, and even if he does see me in a negative way, I have a lot of value to offer.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So I know when I went in to see him, I was 80% less nervous and felt confident in my value and open to him as a person. I don't know how he's going to see me. I know that changed the outcome. He actually became a client, and we had he retired recently, but we had 30 years of friendship. So yes, I'm again just completely agreeing with you.
There's something very osmotic about
Yeah.
the shifts we make inside. And again, whether you're a leader at a company or you're somebody going for a job interview or
Yep.
any other situation, I think we often forget that situations there's something dynamic kind of built into most situations. There's something mutable that when we shift, there's all kinds of other stuff that shifts that people pick up on, whether it's consciously or more subconsciously.
100%. I feel like in so much current and recent research about humans and their interaction shows this, we're connected on so many more levels than we even recognize. And so I love people like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, who basically said, be the light, be the light that you want to see in the world. Be that. That's the most powerful thing. And it really is, like, on many levels, osmotic and psychological and emotional, like the way you get rid of darkness is you shine a light. You don't try and remove the darkness, you shine a light, you turn a light, and we can be that light. And in change, especially as a leader, that is really important to know, that to not get, because sometimes as a leader, I know I was just talking to some clients who are going through a huge change, and we were talking to one of the leaders of the change team, and I could tell he was a little beaten down. There's a lot happening. And I just said to him, look, you are such a powerful force for good in this. Don't lose sight of that, because you seeing clearly where we're trying to get to, and that you can get to that, is very powerful. And I could tell that was really helpful to him, really reassuring and helpful to him,
It's so great. There's so many gems in what you're talking about and in your book. Erika, I'm wondering, what have I not asked that I should have? What, as we were coming to the close of our time together, what is something that you would like to share that we haven't yet touched on?
Well, we've touched on it a little bit, but I want to reinforce it because it's so critical. I know this time can seem so overwhelming to people, and it is. I mean, there's so much happening, and gosh, I was saying change was already like a geometric curve, and now it's just on the vertical slope of the geometric curve. The pandemic just took the top off of change. I remember, I'm sure everybody has a similar memory, when we were almost exactly 2 years ago, we were just understanding that this was something really different than anything else. And I remember, this may seem so silly in retrospect, but I remember right around this time, toward the beginning of March, I found out that they were going to cancel the St. Patrick's Day parade in New York. And I was like, what? They can't do that. And then 2 days later, I heard that they were canceling the NBA finals. And then 3 days after that, I heard that they were closing all the schools. So it just was like, it just kept ramping up. They can't wait. They can't wait. They can't, and so that we've all experienced 1,000, they can't possibly, we can't possibly. So I feel like it's just taken the lid off of change, and people are exhausted, and people are wondering, people are still trying to, that homeostatic urge, when can we go back to normal? It's not going to go back to normal. It's going to be a new normal. It's going to keep evolving. So in the midst of that, what I really want people to understand is you can become change capable. This is within your power as a human being. You can rewire yourself to be open to change, to see change, necessary change in a neutral way, and to be much more fluid and capable of going through it more quickly, less painfully. We can do this. We have it in our power, every single human being, to become more change capable.
That's so true. And I love that. And it's a wonderful summary of all of the gems that are in your book and in your work in general. So the book, Change from the Inside Out, Making You, Your Team, and Your Organization Change Capable. Erika Andersen, thank you so much for being here. Where is the best place for people to find you and more about your wonderful book?
I love that question. So they can go to my website, which is Erika Andersen. Both my names are spelled oddly, ErikaAndersen, erikaandersen.com. And they can also go to my business website, which is Proteus, Proteus-international.com. You can find out about all the work we do, my books, my podcast, whatever you'd like. And you can also find out how to connect to me on social media, which I would love. So
that's right. And I forgot to mention that your podcast is consistently a top-rated leadership podcast. So
it is.
Quite a phenomenon.
It's 15 minutes, and it's hopefully you'll always have practical takeaways. So
that's wonderful. Erika, again, thank you so much for being with me. This has been another episode of Unpacking Possibility. If you enjoyed the episode, I hope you remember to like, share, and follow. And until next time, be well.